It's getting ready. Let me see if there are other Paulo. Cristiano, mandei o link para ali do YouTube. Ele ainda não está, né? A gente vai.
Está vivo ainda.
Assim que a gente começar, eu boto lá.
Uhum. Antônio, tu quer fazer a apresentação inicial?
Bom.
Ou faço?
Mas você mesmo, Moisés. Você já está em cima do laço aí. Okay. Mais fácil. Se quiser passar a palavra para o Cristiano para falar lá da SBS, do CPSS, do comitê, da comissão.
Na próxima, o Rodrigo fala sobre essa atividade. Ele que está por dentro aí dos detalhes. Bom, a gente tem a Unfox agora, semana que vem.
Da existência da comissão, só isso, Cristiano. Você também está mais por dentro.
Tá bom. Mas aí para falar para ela conhecer um pouco, é isso?
Isso. Para compartilhar com pessoas aí que estão assistindo, né, que talvez não saibam.
Beleza, tá.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and good morning for Michelle, because it's 11 hours ahead of us. It's really a great pleasure to have you here for this topic of developmental state, especially because you are presenting a new approach on your. You're going to present a new approach on your talk, and I have already seen your research. And I'd like to thank all the participants in this webinar to tell you that it's being streamed with YouTube. And it's going to be, Michelle is a sociologist, and she's an associate professor at the University of at Sinica in Taiwan, Taipei. And she has been doing research since her PhD on topics related to industrial and technological development from we could say institutional and partially economic, sociological point of view. So without further ado, it's going to be 40-minute talk. It's going to be around 40 minutes, 40 or 50 minutes talk. And then you have 30 minutes for Q&A. So we've opened to the floor after her talk. And just before passing it on to Cristiano, Cristiano is going to talk about there is a section in the Brazilian Association of Sociology. There is a section of the economic sociology, like in most other associations across the world. And he's going to present it briefly for you and for the other colleagues, but it's going to be a very short presentation. Just
okay, sure.
Okay, and then the stage is yours.
Okay. Okay.
Good evening and good morning to Michelle.
Morning.
It's a great pleasure to have you presenting your paper and sharing your ideas with us. I'm Cristiano Monteiro from Universidade Federal Fluminense in Niterói, Rio de Janeiro. Thanks, Moisés, for giving us a few moments to talk about our actually two current institutional spaces that we have here in Brazil for economic sociology. I'd like to mention the working group on society and economic life that we're going to get together in a couple of weeks in the first between it's going to be December 7th and 8th. We're going to have 2 days of activities where we're going to see different perspectives on economic sociology in Brazil, including some papers that actually have a lot to do with the kind of work that we're going to see today, that Michelle is going to present. The other activities, the work is it used to be a working group, but now it's a research committee. The Brazilian Society of Sociology has decided to adapt its structure to get similar to what ISA does, the International Sociological Association does, with a research committees. So we have one on economic sociology. We're going to, the meeting, it has a biannual meeting that's going to happen. The next one is going to be in July of next year. And we're still waiting for the deadline, especially for submission of papers. But I'm sure we also have a lot of papers on economic sociology in the intersection with political economy. So basically that's it. A few words only, and thanks again, Moisés, Antonio. It's very good to be with you guys here today, and especially to listen to Michelle's presentation.
Thank you. Okay, so now I start to talk.
Yes,
can I respond to Christian first?
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you to Moisés for inviting me, and also I just want to make a quick comment about your economic sociology program. Actually, I have been working with the ISA Economic Sociology Committee, and we actually formed a session at the 2021, supposedly to be this year, but because of the COVID, it's been delayed, 2021, the ISA Forum, which was going to take place in Brazil. We actually organized a session on doing economic sociology in Latin America. I think the organizer was Nadia from, do you know her? I forgot her last name. Yes. Yeah. So, and I think that's great to learn that. So it was great to meet you. And then I think maybe perhaps I'll email you the sessions that we call for your reference, because the session got canceled because of the Mexican colleague and also Chilean colleague who could not participate for this particular session. But we hope to continue in 2022 ISA Congress for that matter. And then I think I would like to share with you for that information, and perhaps can call for more participation. Yeah.
That's great. Excellent.
And so now, now I guess I turn to my talk, the topic today. Let me share I prepare a PowerPoint, and so we'll see. Hopefully it won't, just let me figure out how to share the screen first. Okay. Oh, it says you didn't allow people share screen, the host.
Okay.
So you need to.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you for all taking part on this. I know it's quite late in Brazil right now, and so I appreciate your attendance. Okay.
Is it working now?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Okay. I need to. Okay. Just a minute. Can you see?
Not yet.
Oh no, yeah, I haven't shared. Okay.
Okay, now it's, okay.
Can you see that? Because I cannot see what I'm. Hang on.
Yes, we can see the
the slides. Or
I think it's big enough. Maybe perhaps if you manage to turn to presentation mode.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, there we got it. So can you? Is that you see the PowerPoints now? Because on my Zoom screen I cannot see the Okay. So the topic today, the topic for my talk is, as Moises just introduced, it's about developmental state in East Asia, and I focus on the case of Korea. This is a new research I've been doing. My prior research has been focused on Taiwan-Korea comparison, more focusing on the contemporary, the consequences or the process of the latecomers catch up and the innovation that facilitates. And right now, this paper is more this research also, this is part of a bigger research. And I just wrote up this paper in the last year as a summary on the Korean part. But later I just want to give you a background information right now. So I'll get to the Taiwan and Korea comparison in my overall project. But for now, this presentation was more focusing on Korea, which is the poster child of the developmental state thesis when you look at a post-war development. And this paper, this research focused more on the earlier period, the origin, the formation of the developmental state, as opposed to what the state did. So here, I'll give you a little bit background of this, and let me show you a slide. Okay, hang on. So this is kind of where we are at when you go to Korea. Let's say you arrive at Korean airport, and this is what you see. They talk about, welcome to Korea and the country of innovation. And I think in many ways, Korean's achievement was remarkable. Like it has, if you compare among a lot of the OECD countries and even late industrializers, it's leading in government expenditure on R&Ds. And it is also a powerhouse for innovation, and it has been ranked as top 3. If you look at the patents, like people often use patent to measure innovation capacities, and among the top 3 at the US Patents and Trademark Office. And also, and one thing I would like to highlight of how this occurred is that, and also, before I go into that, and also another remarkable indicator people often talk about is if you look at Korean's GDP per capita was about 100 US in 1965, which was beyond the Philippines. And it kind of scaled up. It reached about 1,800 US in 1980. And to now, in 2018, just to give you an idea, it's about 30,000 US per capita. So it's remarkable to thinking of, moving from you think of comparing just the Philippines versus Korea or Taiwan. Taiwan and Korea in that similar trajectory. They kind of, so they're really the story of the post-war economic miracle in that sense. And even when, so that's where we are looking at this. So people often wonder what's the, sorry, I'm just trying to. The success. So the conventional story often would quickly point it to the role of the developmental state. And this is often, or some people emphasizing on this kind of modernization strategies of the Japanese Meiji Restoration. Often they're connecting with this kind of latecomers. It has they're focusing on the emphasis of science and technology in the process of nation building. So I give you some slogans here. So often it appear in the emphasis on developmental state or on this enlightened leader, Park Chung-hee, and often his speech often resonate those notions of, you need to have a strong army, rich nation. So in this so what I want to do for this paper was to connect the notion of science and technology with looking at the post-war industrialization and development in South Korea and also more generally in East Asia. And for the Korean part, I do this by studying the first existing study, mostly focusing on bureaucracy or how the government make policies, but we still don't know how certain policies were chosen. So this paper was mostly looking at the micro foundation of the developmental state. And I kind of connect, instead of just looking at inter-bureaucracies, I look at the kind of behind the scene, the scientists and engineers that kind of help to shape the specific direction of the industrial development and also scientific and development. And so quickly give you an overview to situate my debate. So the conventional view, like I said, is state-led development. And mostly existing literature, when you think of developmental state, you're focusing on industrial policy, industrial targeting. And how you do this is through control of finance, the state allocating resources to targeted areas to induce entrepreneurs to enter industry that they would otherwise not enter. So typically, kind of the George Crumb kind of late industrialization thesis. And the typical was Meredith Wu Cummings' book on developmental state in South Korea, and focusing on how the state used the control of finance to induce the large conglomerates, the jaebos in Korea, to kind of, to enter particular industries. That was a classic case. The other approach focusing on the, like I mentioned, this is Park Chung-hee, this leader, focusing on the leader and his background in military. He was a high-ranked military soldier during the Japanese period, and how his experience kind of shaped, this kind of developmental driven approach. But the problem is, or they talk about the the nationalism and developmental will of the bureaucracy. But I think that's kind of missing, because if you compare with India, you also got a strong state, but also have a developmental will, but it doesn't translate. Kind of, I think Chibe 2003 book talking about it kind of lack, when they compare India with South Korea, it kind of lacked the Indians, despite the strong state and developmental will, because the capitalist was not willing to tag along. So it kind of locked India into a place. And so they were contrasting how the Koreans were able to indeed, the discipline, the capitalist. But the problem was, the view is that with the conventional debate on developmental state focusing on the relationship, if you look at those literature focusing on the relation, it's become a very nationalist approach, in the sense that focus on the relationship between the state and capital in a domestic sector society. And then look at the transformation was how the state was introduced to induce entrepreneurs. But it doesn't tell the control of allocation of resources, but it doesn't tell us much about how technology arose as a force of development, or as why the state's committed to development in the first place. And I think people just assume that, you induce the capital, so then people can acquire technology and buy technology and just development would happen. But often it doesn't work that way. If you look at most of the technology development in East Asia, was very indigenous driven. So the other approach I just want to highlight was the other approach was often emphasize that geopolitics or transnational networks induced industrial development. And this approach could be, if you look at, was a more the world system theorist approach. That was the East Asia was able to develop because it was a development by invitation, was U.S. Cold War context. So East Asia has access to a U.S. market, or the U.S. aid help the East Asian developing the infrastructure that facilitates subsequent export-led industrialization. Or you have the, some begin to argue the Japanese colonial legacy that kind of shaped the developmental state, but that doesn't tell you the processes. Or you have the post-war, the global value chain production, basically was similar to the kind of a variation war system, those East Asian countries, those firms will be able to connect it to the global value chain, and so able to move up the technology ladder. And the other approach was a lot of geographers now are talking about, they're focusing on the geopolitics, focusing on the war, Cold War, they're focusing on the Cold War military industrial complex of Vietnam War. So the argument here was also the development was independent of the state, meaning was the US military procurement that gave, for example, give South Korean Jabil a head start because Hyundai, the largest conglomerates in Korea at the time, was able to do kind of construction work for the US, and that gave them a boost for the subsequent capital accumulation and technology development. So that was the kind of argument for this transnational approach, often was to refute the developmental state thesis. So arguing development was independent of the state. So my point was, my navigating intervention point here was because I'm looking at connecting technology how technology occurred was a developmental state. So I feel like the dominant approach didn't tell us how industrialization occurred within the national boundary, or how if military, the Cold War geopolitics matters, or military technology, how do they diffuse to the civilian sector? So that was the question and then the other, the missing link here, what I argue was that, so the alternative approach I present here was to connect the both. I want to bring back the geopolitics back into the state-led development by bringing a transnational connection. So basically the idea was how state mediates the transnational forces for national development. So the prior research was more focusing on one or the other, but it's a state versus capital, or, the transnational capital versus the capitalist. But I want to show that how the state was connected to this whole, how the state was actually a mediating force, connecting the transnational forces for this national development project. And I think some of the idea was from this book. I actually, so it's focusing on how the geopolitics has influenced industrialization in countries where interstate competition is higher. The state tend to industrialize because of the competition between countries, and that often leads to overproductions, and countries often emulate similar industrial structures, and that often leads to overproductions. That was an argument made by Sands in 1984. So this kind of bring a geopolitics back in. And also the other is from a lot of historians are now talking about the Cold War geopolitics, how that leads to the state intervention in science and technology. So military, but the case is mostly focusing on the US and European communities, how the US Marshall Plan built the European scientific community. So I'm using that, the same idea was a geopolitics driven science and technology investment, but I want to look at so how does that play out in the latecomers such as East Asia, and I look at Korea. So here I look what I call was self-reliance through global connection. That was kind of the punchline. So basically the idea was debate within Korea or East Asian country was more focusing on nationalist approach. But really, what they argue is a nationalist approach. It was actually they were able to do this was through this their connection was global, was the U.S. was the world. And I argued that I show in the following. I'll give you some examples. I'll show through some cases that how I'll give you some case. Sorry, the reason I'm not flowing well because the screen I see and the PowerPoint is slightly different. That's why I'm a little bit confused. So basically, what I want to show is through those cases, I want to show that how the role of the scientists and technocrats, they were able to shape the direction of the Korean the science and technology development in the 1960s. And so my idea was, so what I would do is through this establishment of the Korean Institute of Science and Technology, hereafter I will call it KIST just to make it to use the abbreviation. So the establishment of KIST in 1966 was crucial in, I argue, that in shaping the, contrary to most focusing on Korean JBOs, Korean private sectors in technology development, I want to show that how the establishment of this research institute provide the foundation, kind of giving a push for the subsequent technology and research, and also export-led industrialization. And through their programs, the KISS industrial programs, the first was the build of the first modern integrated steel plant, POSCO. POSCO, that's the company name. And then also their shipbuilding program, because Korea, if you look at now, Korea has one of the largest ship building sector in the world. And then the third one, if the time permits, I'll get to, was the mechanical engineering program, which laid the foundation for the subsequent heavy chemical industrialization that people talk about in the 1970s. So before I go to that, I'll talk briefly the methodology I use. Basically, I was lucky, like I was being able to interview with the remaining the scientists I recruited to KIST, and also their involvement with the government at the time in the late 1960s to early 1970s, and also a key bureau technocrats who helped to formulate the HCI in 1970. And then also, so I verified some of the sources. I started with the interviews. I verified the facts and sources with Korean newspapers, and also the KIST original documents. Frankly, my Korean is not that good, but because of this earlier period of the U.S. involvement, so a lot of for example, the original KIST organizational documents are in English. So I was able to verify that. And most of the interviewees I spoke, they all study abroad. So the English was quite good. And that's how I started. But I verified, I have a student help me translate some of the newspapers. So I was able to verify the findings. And also the archives. And also we look at the memoir, but there was key memoirs of those two key technocrats, like Owen Cho and Kim Jong. They both work in the Blue House in the 70s. And it was interesting, if you look at the English literature on the Korean developmental state, most of the sources cited from those two people. They become the key sources, people, and especially Owen Cho was influential in drafting the HCI industrialization. But however, my narrative was slightly different because I'm focusing on the period from 1966 to 1973. I argue was a continuity. What happened in 1973, the HCI drive, most people argue that was the beginning of the developmental state. But I showed that, it was a continuity through this whole process. So just before we get onto the cases, there was just give you some it's in Korean. And this was a book on Park Jun by Cater. it's about a military origin. And then Engineer for Korea, those Korean book. These two books are about KISS and about the scientists, the role of the scientists. So let me get to the case. Give you a story on the establishment of KISS in 1966. So how did KISS come about? The U.S. side of the story talk about it was the U.S. aid. The establishment of KISS was significant because it was the first U.S. Technical assistance to developing world. So in that sense, it was relevant in understanding the context through U.S. aid. And how did it come about was the story was often on paper was technical assistance, but on the private, often people talk about was a gift from President Johnson to thank Korea's involvement in the Vietnam War, because Korea deployed the second largest troops. Korea was very involved helping the U.S. in the Vietnam War. So that was a token of appreciation. And so the official story often talk about Donald Hornick, who was the science advisor to President Johnson. He suggested President Johnson an Applied Industrial Research Center prior to the U.S. summit, the Korean U.S. summit in 1965. And this was the first presidential visit by President Park to the U.S. after the military coup. So it was working out, and then so he proposed the Applied Research Center. But the anecdote story was some Korean talk about, actually initially he proposed was more a vocational college for training skills, but I couldn't find the sources. But anyway, I verified several sources, even from the US, and his memoir, he also talked about mostly was the result was this Applied Industrial Research Center. But the Korean side of story, and so that was the story, but on the Korean side of story was that I think Korea often emphasized since Park took over the power in early 1960s, they were already interested in build a research institute, a lot of scientists who was behind the scene wanted to establish research institutes, but there was a lot, and then they went to the US and studied different research institute. But the problem at that time was they didn't have the money to realize the project. But nevertheless, for the establishment of KISS, what was unique about this was the contract-based research, as opposed to a complete government funded. So it's applied research. and here, so what happened was after that summit, U.S. sent a team by Donald Hornick with the Bell Lab Research Institute, the president of Bell Lab Research, and also Battelle Memorial Research Institute. The teams went to survey Korea to do a feasibility study. So they came back and proposed that they think Korea should establish a Applied Research Institute. And Donald Hornick's argument is that the logic is that, when you establish a research institute in developing countries, often researchers are more interested in doing project with advanced countries, things that interest advanced countries researchers, their counterparts, as opposed to address the needs of local industries. So he suggested applied research is a contract-based research, meaning that you get your funding from the local industry and plus the government funding. So you hopefully this kind of contract-based research will be more would be responding to the need of local industry. So that was how the idea of applied industry came about. So he made that proposal. So the other recommendation was, so they assigned Battelle Memorial Research Institute in Columbus, Ohio, which was applied research, contract-based applied research as the sister institute. So basically KISS was established modeling after Battelle. So Battelle played a very significant role in the earlier development. For example, and they have a lot of report. And the first thing they did was they conducted an industrial survey in Korea together with the Korean team and the US team. So they identify look at what the local industry is like and identify 5 areas for research, from food science to chemical engineering to a lot of mostly mechanical and material science engineering, to provide the basics for industrialization. And another significant approach here was that establishment was for Donald Hornick. His argument was to address by recruiting a lot of Korean scientists and engineers trained in the US or abroad. So it was trying to reverse that brain drain. So you recruit talents from abroad and return to Korea. So the pictures here were the first 18 returning scientists coming from abroad, and how, as my story will show, how they play a very significant in the earlier period of the Korean industrialization by they provide a lot of input and recommendation to the Economic Planning Board, and also basically the think tank for President Park. And here, this is just give you a quick list of the name of the first 18 scientists. And the people I circled through, which I will talk about subsequently, how they play a role in establishment of the steel industry and also the shipbuilding, and how the Mr. The third one, he played a big role bringing kind of economic feasibility study to when they do those industrial development plans. And if you look at those, their background mostly came back from the US, but Mr. Kim Jae-kwon, the one I will speak to, he actually had the training in Germany, and how that really helped to influence the direction of the steel industry. So let me briefly talk about the role of the KISS and its connection with the Korean state. Dr. Choi Hyun-suk, he was the head of the KISS when it first established, and he had a background. He was an interesting person. He had a background in from University of Minnesota, but his prior, I think he did a master in Japan, so he has a connection for both world, Japan and the U.S. And then also the person in the picture was actually he was a secretary and science advisor to EPB and President Blue House. Blue House was the presidential office in Korea at the time. So this picture was when I interviewed him. He was telling me about how they went to Columbus, Ohio, Battelle Memorial, how they had meetings and recruiting, selecting the returnees, interview with the scientists. And most scientists at the time, the first 18 scientists, people who were recruited, according to Battelle Memorial Institute's recommendations, most people would have the industry experience in the US or overseas prior to return to Korea. So the idea was that they would be better in tune with industry's needs. So, and one thing about KISS was, contrary to other research institutes in many countries, I think it was a very strong direct involvement. President Park was KISS. And so even in my interview with those scientists, the remaining scientists, they often talk about they were called to the meetings by the president. When president had meetings with the EPB or the bureaucrats, they will be called to the meetings and providing their inputs. And most of them returnees, they were in their 30s. So they feel like they often talk about, it was such an honor that President Park valued their inputs, and then value their recommendations. And also there was anecdotal story about how they receive a much higher salary, better benefits compared to local academics. And even President Park backed that decision, saying that it's okay to give them higher salaries because there was a resentment within the local academics. And so often, if you go to KISS now, I think there was still a President Park statue because he was often associated with the founder. So this kind of very rare kind of a state was very close to a scientific institute. So at the time, even though the US wanted a small applied research institute, but Korean government actually wanted a big research, wanted to be one of the biggest in East Asia. So they were close. And contrary to my study on Taiwan, because in Taiwan, the case of Taiwan has a similar applied research institute established in 1973 modeling after KISS. But in Taiwan, the case mostly talking about how the scientists and engineers, they work closely with the private industry, and then they become entrepreneurs and set up firms, how they sow the seeds for entrepreneurship. But in the Korean context, I think was more typical. The scientist was more closer to the state, working with the bureaucracy, and even none of them most of them didn't, look at their career trajectory, they didn't move on to private sector. Even though when you have the growth of big JBOs, those people continue, they move on from maybe to the government and then later on to other research institutes. So their career, through their livelihood, was mostly in the public and then research as a researcher. And this, I can skip this. This were just some documents I found, was just showing how President Park valued the KISS scientists. There was the document writing to the president about their well-beings, how, since their return. So now I move on. After KISS was established, one of the key things KISS did was they were very involved in POSCO, which is the establishment of the first modern integrated steel plant in 1969. And then I think if you look at the corporate history in POSCO, mostly talk about the chairman's personal connection with Japan and the chairman's vision. So the whole story of how the KISS involvement was kind of wiped out in the story. And I think I'm retelling the story in a sense to show you that how the KISS were having a national capacity to make some decision doesn't matter in terms of influencing the outcome. So KISS building a steel industry has been always on the back mind of Park Chung-hee, and this is a slogan here. We're just kind of in slogan by President Park talking about how steel is the nation. Having a steel plant is a nation power. The idea of strong army, rich nation, and prior to 1960, in the 1960s, even though Korea wanted to build a modern steel plant, it was rejected by the U.S. and the World Bank, because I think there was a proposal by 1967. They thought they worked through a consortium alliances with the U.S. and European countries and hoping to get loans from the World Bank. And there was a proposal done by the KISA, the Korean the Steel Association, that was through the foreign associates. They proposed a 600,000 tons steel plant, but that proposal was rejected by the World Bank and also the US. And under the premises, they think there was already an overcapacity of steel production in the world at that time. And also they're talking about developing countries such as India, and also actually they used Brazil as a case in that time, already had an overcapacity, and that might lead to a debt crisis in those developing countries. And the concern, they were not going to be able to consume that many tons of steel in those countries. So that was rejected. And that was a big earthquake, a political shake up the political cabinets in Korea, because President Park and the EPB thought that was a sure thing. They were going to get this by 1968. And also actually POSCO, the company, was already established and waiting for the funding. And then the conventional story to tell you, so then instead of getting money, funding or finance from European and US. So it was a Japanese repatriation fund. The Japanese repatriation fund is colonial period, repaid back for the war crime, and the repatriation fund helped to fund past the establishment of this steel plant. And also, and often the story talk about Park Tae-jun, which was the chairman, the founder of POSCO. And he was educated in Japan, and they talk about how he was able to lobby with the Japanese capitalists and then facilitate this. But I think that may be part of the story, but part of the story was the Japanese repatriation fund. Initially, it was mostly for like develop technological assistance from developed world to developing country at that time, was focusing on agriculture and infrastructure development, not for building a modern steel plant. And also from a Japanese point of view, they think that if you want steel, you can just buy from Japan, because already you think that time was overcapacity in the world. So for the Japanese steel plant, it was the best interest was for the Korean to buy the steels rather than make their own plant. And so the kids play a key role here. So that earthquake, so that was the rejection from the World Bank. So they quickly formed a task force within Korea. They try to figure out how to do next. They want to build a steel plant and then a proposal. So the EPB was EPB, the head or EPB at that time was a gentleman called Kim Hong-ryo. Mr. Kim, he was also educated in the US. He was an economist by training, but he has a very close relation. The KISS scientist who was behind his scene in formulating this project. And they produced an economic and technological feasibility study. And so they went on to negotiate with Japan during the first Japan-Korea cabinet meeting, talking about, basically those meetings are talking about how do you use the Japanese repatriation fund. So, and what was significant in that, and the picture here was that proposal, initial proposal. What was significant in that, there was the two gentlemen from KISS, like one of them was Dr. Kim, the one I said who studied in Germany. And he, the story here was he was one of the first 18 returnee to KISS, and he used to work at the MAG in Germany before returning. So he had a long interest in steel industry, and he actually he gave a proposal to President Park in 1964 about developing a steel plant in Korea. That when President Park visited Germany for the first time. And then, so he was part of in that task force, and he was key in drawing those recommendations and lay out the plant. And this Mr. Yun, he is a field economist in KISS, and he trained in the US. He conducted the economic feasibility study for the programs. And the story here was they came up with the proposal for 1 million tons for the forecast for the steel plant. But then most people argue that 1 million tons is a minimum scale economy for a modern integrated steel plant. But I think what they did was they were able to show how Korea was able to consume that. The feasibility study was trying to show how Korea can consume that amount of steel like you produce. And so that was and this gentleman said that he learned, and then they went on to that negotiation table. And this Mr. Yun told me, he said he used the thing he learned in the US, the input-outputs matrix. And then he kind of explained to the Japanese counterparts. And Japanese were very interested in how his methodology. So it turned out to be a very engaged discussion that showing that, the Korean has this kind of capacity, the kind of expertise. And Mr. Kim, he was also important in the subsequent negotiation. Let me go back to this one. Oh, sorry. He was very crucial, Dr. Kim. In the subsequent, once that was approved to build the plan, so next was they have to select the specs the plan. So he was very influential because for the Japanese interest was to sell them the outdated one, right? The capitalists would just say and also I checked with some of the Japanese researchers on this subject. They think that Korea was not prepared for more advanced equipment. But he pointed out, he insists on certain, for example, for the casting, he wanted continuous casting or rolling equipment. He wanted more advanced. His view was because he had a vision of he wanted to build auto industry and ship. He already had in mind he wanted to build auto industry and shipyard as part of the project. So he wanted a thick plate. Basically, he wanted more advanced equipment. So it's in that negotiation that they were able to basically enforce that kind of purchase. And then also often people talk about the rope kits was they help in mediating a subsequent technological assistance from Japan. And this was just a picture of the first task force. And okay. And this was just the picture of the name, the people I talk about, because, and then the reason I'm telling you this story was because in the Korean narratives, the role of the kids was mostly wiped out. And then my interviewee often talk about it here. In the actual documents, it just talk about the task force. But if you look at this, you look up this paper, underneath was actually the KIST signature, like the research institute, and also like Dr. Kim Jae-kwan, he laid out the plan. So anyway, and this was just the picture from his earlier proposal to President Park. He argued, and then later on he went on to did the automobile promotion program in 1973. And then I'll just quickly talk about the shipbuilding program. So after POSCO was established and those kid scientists were thinking, how do you consume the 1 million tons? They already had in mind was they talk about the shipbuilding was use the most of the steel plate. So they, and then Dr. Kim Hong-cho, this gentleman I interviewed, he was the key person who was basically influential in do the shipbuilding program, and he himself is a naval architect PhD from University of Michigan, and he was in charge of the shipbuilding program. And he was telling, because shipbuilding again, it was not something just came out of blue. It has always been in President Park's administration's radar since early 1960s, but the problem was always financing. So what he did at that time was different from the other earlier, was he was able to figure out the financing part. So he was telling me how he proposed that building this very large crude carriers, the oil carriers, that would be like, that was kind of technologically more feasible for latecomers. But also it's a large scale. So what needs is the capital, and it's labor intensive. And within EPB at that time, most people thinking, oh no, we can work with Japan again. But he himself, he talked about how he actually was against the idea working with Japan because he think Japan was the competitor at that time. And then also he looked at Japan would be outsourcing the subcontracting. He didn't think that would lead to the more kind of technology development that Korea needed. But at the time, what also happened was, I say it's actually the British connection as opposed to the Japanese connection, was that there was this guy, James Teasdale. He was a senior lecturer in University Newcastle. He was also AMP Ecuador was very crucial in connecting the Korean shipbuilding program. And he and Dr. Kim were classmates. Well, they were kind of classmate and professor at University of Michigan. So they met again in Korea. So what James Teasdale was proposing at that time to Kim was that U.S. To solving the financing problem, he said basically could be using the print. For shipbuilding, you need a print design. Buy the design print from AMP Ecuador, and all the parts coming from AMP Ecuador, and having Korea assemble the ship, and then AMP Ecuador would take the ship basically. So they think that that was his proposal. So that was, and then through several. So there were other incidents, but basically that was the idea of through this British arrangement. So they were able to financing, in the end, they were able to financing with Barclays Bank in Britain, in England. And even without a shipyard built, there was no ship, and they were able to, with some guarantee, basically the Korean government provided guarantee. And then, this AMP Ecuador then approached Scott Lithgow in Scotland to provide a training support for Hyundai. And he talked about how he picked Hyundai shipyard. He thought Hyundai shipyard was the potential, has more potential, because there were other competing shipyard companies, but much smaller. But Hyundai, the background of Hyundai shipyard was, at the time, it was Hyundai construction company. They have no experience in shipbuilding. So they often talk about, the anecdote story was they were at that meeting with President Park, with the EPB. So they present their proposal. And Hyundai, and I think a lot of those conglomerates, they wanted to, President Park wanted to pressure a lot of conglomerates to go into the shipbuilding, but nobody wanted to go because of the risk involved. And Hyundai, the chairman just come up and say, this from the proposal, it sounds like buying the prints and then assemble. He said it sounds like building it's like a construction company. So he would like to try. So that was the anecdote story behind the people talking about. And then, but if you look at Hyundai's corporate history, it's also the story always started with the Hyundai chairman, how he he found a British connection. But I think there's this kind of KISS connection that's never been told. And also, this was just the chart in that plan they proposed. They talk about how do you solve the financing, and he was telling me how this one different from the earlier finance was the being able to convince the foreign bank to finance this. Also some pictures I found from the archives about the Hyundai shipyard. And the first ship that was going to Atlantic Baron, that was the first ship that they were built. Okay, and then I will use that another 10 minutes just to talk about the last thing I want to talk about was the connection with how people talk about the HCI programs. So basically most stories talking about, so KISS was also influential in the mechanical engineering program, and also they were very tied to the, a lot of the defense project in the early 1970s. So basically, and often that was argued, you know, the HCI has that background was the geopolitics and the national security reasons. That's what Korea launched HCI. And most story started when 1973, but I want to show that how this early 1970, the program they did was kind of laid the foundation for that 1973 HCI program. So what they did was, so in 1970, what was also happened was the tension with North Korea was increasing, while also US was talking about withdrawing troops in East Asia. So there was a pressure for President Park with self-reliance in defense. So if you look at his 1970 slogan, January, he was talking about self-support, self-reliance, and self-defense. This kind of notion throughout his slogan in 1970 is often about self-reliance, self-defense through science and technology. And so one of the things they did was first thing he did was establish agency for defense development. if you look at the KISS connection, was KISS and ADD, they were built next to each other. So there was just a picture. And a lot of the KISS, the scientists I interviewed, they all went to ADD for for that period of time, 1970 to 75, working on project. And they often don't talk about what they did. But I think it was related to the defense and mechanical. And so there was this key, people talk about the four-core factory program. So it was developed heavy industry and Korean-made country. The four core factories, basically it was cast irons, special steel, heavy machinery, and shipbuilding plants. And in particular, I think they were the foundation for the mechanical engineerings. So this was the I'll show you the English one. In this proposal, in this plan, they had like 4 languages. Apparently, it was English, Korean, and Japanese, and German. I was told that, and I found English and Korean, and I was able to find, basically because they draft this. It was on paper, it was a plan for developing mechanical engineering industries, kind of the foundation of the industrialization. But within this proposal, you look, there was this establish 4 core factories, and that was more the defense orientation. So basically the defense industry was packaging in this mechanical engineering program. And so they used this, they want to seek money from, so this was the original picture. So people, I happen to read some, there's some recent publications in English talking about the connection between geopolitics and industrialization in Korea. They often talk about this, the 4 core factory program. And that was the chart from this. And then I was really excited when I found this from the book. So they're talking about how you have this, the heavy industry complex, and then you build a complex and you have those factories next to each other. And so that was the ideal, how they think the industrialization can occur. But also, during the peacetime, you do this for industrialization. During the wartime, you can turn it into a defense. You can make weaponries. So basically, so what happened was this proposal. So then the initial idea was that they can try to find money, they need financing. So they will find from Japanese. Again, just think of Japanese repatriation fund, but Japanese, of course, deny because even though they package it in as a mechanical engineering program, but Japan denied. So they went on to seek funding over through a lot of advanced countries, but they were unable to. So that kind of caused a rupture within the bureaucracy with EPB and President Park on this project. And I think the disagreement was also on the speed HCI should take, and also the export target. And I think I kind of went through your the other webinar by Professor Kwon. I think he kind of briefly mentioned about this. He talked about how the Ministry of Commerce kind of gained power. And I think that was referring to this, how because of this rupture, EPB used to be the pilot agency for economic development in Korea. And because of this rupture, it was kind of MCI, the Ministry of Commerce kind of took the lead because the President Park centralized the command through Blue House. So anyway, what happened was, despite my point here was that the proposal, they were unable to execute it because of lack of funding. So most of the story started with 1973 when Blue House centralized the control. And the behind scenes story was Owen Cho, the guy from Ministry of Commerce, not part of the EPB faction, was from the other faction. He went up to President Park and said he had an idea. He said, he said, getting the private sector involved in the HCI. So 70%, mostly, so those compounds, you have the Hyundai, and try to induce the big conglomerates to take part in those production. And 20%, 70% for export, and 20% for military purposes. So that was his idea. And he proposed to add petrochemical and also add another parts component. So that kind of become the story most focusing on 1973 HCI and Owen Cho as the key planner. But my argument is if you review those archives, and I think at those programs, I think there's that continuity. And what might be different was that the agent, for example, induced more private sector, like conglomerates. But even that, through the interviews with those scientists, I think that was in the back of their mind already, because at the time when they drafted this mechanical engineering program, they were looking for export-led items. So it's not as, so it's not a simple dichotomy like 4 core factories versus HCI, but I think it was a continuity. And then, so another thing I want to show, but I won't talk much because that's just something I just discovered last year, but I haven't get a chance to finish, was because it was really difficult to get access with like Agency of Defense Development, talking about what they do. Like one of the person I interviewed, they talk about the KISS who drafted, the people who drafted this, one of the guy who, the people, I interviewed 2 of them, the people who drafted the mechanical engineering program, there was one guy who was quite influential. He went on to ADD and he was in charge of the missile programs. But he refused to be interviewed, so we don't know. And then we all knew that those 3 people, they all went on to ADD for a period of time. And I think Kim Hong-cho, the one who did shipyard, I think he went on to did some naval ships for the ADD, the Korean defense. But for the missile program, but basically to make that long story short, the missile program, the Polar Bear project, there was a big project within ADD in the 1970s that was tied to this HCI, but also under the radar of the US. It was under the radar and the US discovered it, and then but it got the US approval in the sense that because they need some kind of, I happened to interview the guy who worked on the guidance control. And so the point here was this kind of military diffusion to civilian was very remarkable in the Korean context, because later on he talked about how he moved on. His next post was to Korean's Institute of Telecommunication and Electronic Research Institute, and because of his work was the guidance control, because they use a lot of semiconductor chips, and how he went on to work at telecom. So he oversaw the research consortium of the 4 DRAM megabytes project for Korea, between the Korean company, Samsung, Hyundai, and also the research institute. But so that was just the brief story. Was just, you see a lot of those kind of connection between. My point was through those connection between those engineer scientists, and then how they connect to a lot of different government projects, and that facilitate the kind of diffusion. And for example, that missile project they talk about. There was about 800 people in the project. And then the project was terminated in 78. And then because the military coup, so the President Park was assassinated and the whole project was dissolved. But the people, they kind of went on to the private sector, and some went on to the public sector. Like I mentioned, the guy moved on to electronics. And then later on, you see that kind of connection. But that's my current ongoing project. So hopefully I'll be able to recover that part, talk about the 80s, the development of semiconductor and how that connect, and also telecommunication and how that, maybe, I don't know, my hypothesis is there's a connection between, this kind of military diffusion into the civilian sector. But that's the hypothesis need to be tested, and hopefully I'll find something. So anyway, to quickly wrap up, I think I'm going over time here. Just saying that I just want to say, despite the success of KISS initially, actually in 1970, the USA make a evaluation. They think KISS was very successful for a developing model for developing countries. So they even suggest other countries should take on the KIST model. And then I think Taiwan's ITRI, like Industrial Technology Research Institute, which people now often talk about, how that led to the success of Taiwan's IT sector. In fact, initially it was modeled after KIST. So it has that private-public synergy. But on the contrary, KIST initially was a applied research institute. Over time, it became a very elite government-funded institute, basic research, as opposed to the applied research. But its influence was many JBOs. They learned from KIST, and then they kind of inspired JBOs, Korean large companies, to build their in-house R&D. So, for example, Hyundai's Maritime Research Institute, because they interaction with KIST, so they kind of think, oh, we need to do this for our own company. So I think that kind of set the momentum for that kind of R&D at very early beginning. And also KIST found a very specialized government-funded research institute in the 70s, and into each separate research institutes. So basically the point here was, in the Korean context, KIST in the end was kind of they kind of spin off a lot of I call it organizations, but it doesn't spin off entrepreneurship like what we have seen in the Taiwanese story. The Taiwanese narrative was more the apply institute, they learn the technology, they transfer to private sector, and then those researchers often move on to a private, and they kind of sow the seeds for new companies. But in the Korean context, they sow the seeds for a lot of more research institute and bureaucracy and organizations. So this is just 1970 in Nature. They talk about Korean as a model for developing countries. So to conclude, I just want to, so basically just talk about, so we see a kind of hybrid. So basically come back to my point earlier, was the kind of national project was not, the kind of self-reliance project doesn't happen in a vacuum of the leadership, but I think it was a lot of the transnational connection and how those scientists kind of mediates the connection between and then kind of turn it into its own national advantage. So I think I will just conclude here. I know I'm running over time. I don't want to bore you anymore. Yeah.
I think there is still a last slide there with a map, or.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that was just initially. Here we're just kind of map of Korea.
Okay. And
I would just want to show you, like Pohang, that's where the steel plant was, and Ulsan was where the shipyard was choose. And then Daejeon, that's where a lot of research park later on centered. And then Seoul, that's Seoul, right? And Incheon, yeah. We'll just kind of give people a sense, yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I really loved the details and the smaller, let's say, I think that your major contribution in this debate is to recast the role of agency. So there is a lot of decisions are made by people. There are social networks, there are influences, there are ideas which travel from different people in different organizations and in different countries and different contexts. I'd like to make some comments on the paper and your presentation.
Yeah.
I make some critical comments concerning things I missed in your paper, and perhaps also in the presentation. I don't know to what extent you have been developing these things, and probably have more data on that. First of all, this idea of when in your paper you explore the rival theories to explain the success of catching up process and upgrading in South Korea. And I think it was very interesting because you worked out the different, so the external vulnerability by donor, the state and business relationship by Kim and other authors, and I think that was very interesting. I really liked it because you could set precisely, okay, that's what I'm going to contribute in this literature, which is really not covered by former research. Well, when you mentioned and I think it's also, just one more comment about this, I think it's also great to avoid the pitfalls of ex post explanations. There are a lot of ex post explanations, in the sense that, okay, it happened. Now we tell, it's just like there is a book which is Born to Win or Born to Last, something like that. And okay, when the company is successful, then there is a whole narrative tracing back to why it was successful, but sometimes it's made up. So the micro foundations, what I missed was more data on how the ideas and people traveled in the transnational network. Who connected to whom? You mentioned for example, the POSCO's personnel connection with Japan, but what I missed is this. How was the connection between, for example, the South Korean government and these returnees before they were returnees, and how this process started first place? And I found it very interesting, this idea of the huge incentives to bring back home the scientists, but this kind of I think it would be great if you could also sort of give us to the extent you managed to find these connections, sort of visualizing this maybe in a network draw graph or something like that. That would be very interesting. And of course, how this network changes over the time. And I think that one other thing which I missed, and of course this is not exactly what, because you mentioned that KIST, this interaction between firms and KIST, this took place a bit later. Of course, KIST was essentially government funded and government organized. And it happened it firstly happened with technology transfer. And it's interesting to see, because then, as you said at the end of your presentation, you had this technology transfer, and now in the 80s, from the 80s on, it's long-term basic research. And I was just figuring out that it's probably because the firms themselves, they have already internalized the capabilities for research and development and applied research. That's my hunch. But I'd like to, I think this is one point, how exactly the chaebols, because then you have two movements. You have this political strong connecting movement from President Park, bringing the tribal leaders to the table and discussing and establishing the famous carrot and stick policy towards the tribals. But also you have this. How does KIST enter this in this broader business and government connection? Another point I missed, although you mentioned it when you of course you talked about the rejection from the World Bank towards for the financing, the funding of the from POSCO, the heavy steel industry. But what I missed was more of these nuanced political disputes. For example, what were the argument? Okay, the basic argument it was not effective for South Korea to have such a type of industry, but I missed a bit more of the debate around this. Perhaps what were the arguments? President Park was very convinced about that, but it would be interesting to see whether this conviction came out from his interaction with scientists from KIST, or what was KIST's influence on his decisions. And also, when you talk about transnational networks and you emphasize this is and it is from what I have read, it is a new approach to development. To technological development, to explain technological or industrial development in South Korea. Then I missed a bit of the social, informal, and organizational dimensions of these networks, and how it was translated into the South Korean reality. What I mean is, okay, you have this. Is it transnational networks because you managed to bring back these scientists from other parts of the world? But it's also a transnational network in the sense that these scientists had their own connections in different parts. And maybe this is, for example, I found very interesting this idea of the institutional diffusion of the Battelle Memorial Institute to South Korea. And that's also something interesting to see. This a bit of Donald Harnick, because it seems that he had a very innovative idea, not only about technological development, but perhaps about how you should organize this kind of technological institute, and that would be also interesting. Perhaps a footnote on that or something like that. And still talking about the nuanced political disputes, as you mentioned before, the Professor Kwon, his very idea of changing by competition, he delved into the details of this divergence between EPB and the Ministry of Economy regarding export orientation. And you also mentioned this conflict or this disagreement between President Park and EPB. And but what was not clear for me is KIST's role in this idea of technological development to boost exports, and this is something I'd like you to comment on. Okay, just one final comment, and then let's give you time for the replies, for the answers, and also then we open to the floor. Just wrapping it up, this preference from President Park towards technological development, this is a major difference towards our experiences of national developmental projects and substitution import of industrial import substitution, and this focus. How would you say, because he had this Japanese influence, he had this army influence, or it was also because, and he had this idea of a great nation, and that's interesting because in Hsieh's dissertation, he's exploiting, in comparison with Brazil, with our military dictatorship here, which was in the 70s, there was a lot of, there were many initiatives to strengthen national technology and industrial development. But what we see, it was always to talk about the country as a future power. Which never took place, by the way. But in the case of Korea, it's interesting to notice that it was a talk about the nation, and it was not only rhetorical. Because one thing which surprised me, of course, this can be explained by higher educational levels, but one thing that surprised me is the dramatic reduction of inequality during President Park's regime.
Yes,
that was something really amazing. I mean, we had progressive governments in Brazil, but it was far away from anything like that. Okay, that's so. The last question would be about this ideational and this enlightened leadership, but not only enlightened leadership, but the very ideology of Park Chung-hee in this sense. I think, well, then you have as much time as you need, and then we can open to the floor for questions, and questions can also be addressed through the chat. Okay.
Well, thank you. I hope I didn't. Well, thank you. I thought your comments were very helpful. I hope I didn't bore people with the details. I was a bit worried because I didn't know how to project this presentation with a very different audience who don't know much about Korea. So I appreciate your comments, because from your comments seems to get my message. Before I respond to your questions, first, I thought those questions are very valid and very good. I just want to illustrate here some of the slogans to respond to your last point. I know it's not in English or in your in Portuguese translation, but basically here is some of the slogans. I found it particularly also interesting in Park Chung-hee that he came up with a lot of slogans, and I was happened to be able to read the export meeting minutes. Someone gave me like his meetings with the EPB and also with MCI in the 1970s talking about exports. And it was very rare to see, even when I compare Park Chung-hee with Taiwan, like the other, the twin brother of developmental state. I think Park Chung-hee himself, it was very involved in my interviewees or all the reports, you hear him, he's very involved in all the economic plannings. And he sat in a lot of meetings and making decisions. And even also in his slogan here, which is basically a slogan I traced from 1967 to 77. And it often reflect his policy preferences and also what he's thinking. For example, here it talk about export, building a nation with export. That's when you shift to export industrialization. And here in 1970, that's when I talk about a self-reliant, self-defense, and self-support. That was 1970 when, the geopolitical tension that he perceived was intensified. By 1976, felt like he kept coming up, this was saying that build the nation with science, and then build the nation with science and technology independence. The same idea, it's always science, export, and development. And here it's about, the slogan is about, growth and development and technology. That's the means. And here it's about export or trade as the power for the nation. So those are the things that kind of seems to center around his mind. I think in that sense, you can really say some people argue a developmental mindset or developmental state. And I think that's very peculiar or a unique feature of like Preston Park in that sense. But I think, so I'll respond to the last question first, so I haven't figured that out, but I think that's an important element himself it's identified with the development project, or he see that as a priority, or even a lot of speech, he talk about, taking people out of poverty. That seems to strikes him as a very key feature of what he drives him. And then people talk about his background in the military. And also, I also noticed in a lot of the speech, or in a lot of my conversation with the scientists, they often, I asked them that question. I said, why is it he always use numbers and figures? He was like, we need to reach this goal. For example, like 10 billion export by 1980 and 1,000 US GNP per capita. So it's every year you look at his meetings, always about target and numbers. So I asked them, I said, did he just come up these numbers out of the blue, or did he made it up? But they often say that no, they think that might has to do with his military background, or I think his major was recently I found out his major was he was a mathematician. So he was very, so he wants everything to be scientifically measured. Like that's when he deal with his bureaucracy. Like, you need to have a goal, you need to reach the goal, and you mobilize. So that was often throughout the speech and the meeting minutes, you feel like there was a lot of that mobilization going on. So I think that in that regard, you don't see that, even if I look at Taiwan's case, you don't see that kind of mobilization. But in Taiwan was more, the bureaucracy has more the autonomy, right? In making the people who make the decision, economic policy, they have that autonomy. But also you have the very resilient small and medium enterprises. But it's a different story. But for now, let's just focus on Korea. I think that for that matter, I think, so in a sense, but I think my point here was that might be an important factor. But I think that itself is not sufficient to explain the whole process, because you can tell that he relied on those expertise. I think his ability was he was able to listen to, he relied on those expertise to make that decision. And so when it comes to your question about the role of KISS in technology development or boost export, and I think from my reading of the archive, and I think those programs was when KISS worked closely with EPB, Economic Planning Board, in the late 60s and early 70s, before EPB lost to MCI. And I think KISS in its development, technology development, I think it was very clear from the interview I had for the shipbuilding, for example, and for they will always have export in their mind, or steel. I think it was not just never just for, they will always have the export in their mind, because I remember they talk about it, they were thinking, how do they export and how do they, so even when they draft that mechanical engineering program, it's about select items that they could compete. and for export. But somehow that kind of notion kind of get lost in the narratives. People often talk about HCI in the 73 as export driven. But I think that all along, I think KISS was the technology and boost export was going hand in hand. And so the first question was, sorry, what was the first question again? I just lost. I wrote down so many notes I can't even tell.
It was about the networks. To what extent you could explore more at this connections between scientists as abroad before being returnees and what were
I think all we know was those 18 the scientists. We all from the documents we can tell, and from the I don't think many of them are related directly to individuals among the bureaucracy, but they were recruited. I think they call out a program overseas and solicit the participation of Korean scientists who were working abroad at that time. And so I think one of the criteria they were interested was people were already working in the industries in the US or overseas before. They should have like 3 or 5 years of working experience before coming to Korea. And I think that provide to be, so that I think that idea, I think that was Batel's recommendation. And most of those recruitment meetings were taking place in Batel. So people come to they spread the words among the Korean community. And so people went to Batel for interview. So they selected the 18 people. I think from what I understood was so there was no prior kind of personal connection, but of course there's some people joined because they, but later on we do know that, for example, the people I talk about who work on the missile program, apparently they often talk, because when I asked them the question, I said, how do you convey your idea to EPB who are economists and you are scientists and engineers? How do you communicate? And then they talk about how among the key four people in the mechanical engineering program, they talk about how he was one of them, the one who went on to do the missile program. He was actually very close. He has a family connection with the EPB's minister, Mr. Kim. So he said a lot of ideas when they get shoot down, they kind of go back through him. Yeah, but that was not verified. So I couldn't really go on and talk. Yeah, but that was just kind of, one time I asked them that question. I said, how did you convey that message? And I think that KISS they play, I think KISS it was not like Professor Kwon talked about the competition. So I think that the loss of KISS, in response to your question about KISS become a basic research, one argument would be JBOS acquire their capabilities because JBOS was kind of inspired by KISS research model. That's one argument. And I think also what happened in Korea in the context of 1970s, I think it was, like I said, they spin off different research institute. And then KISS, I didn't mention in this talk, KISS was merged with KAIST. That was the Academy for Advanced Studies. And that was another group of people who focusing on training graduate students. You have industrialization, you need, for doing research, you need to have manpower, that's research students. So in the 70s, in the mid 70s, so KAIST merged with KISS. So now that's why you have KAIST. That's one of the leading academic research school for advanced studies in Korea, KAIST. So KAIST gained an upper hand in the 70s. And so then by the time, then you have the military. I think in Korea, one thing I found was bureaucracy. Maybe it was changed by competition, or I always find the bureaucracy was never as stable. When I make a comparison with Taiwan's bureaucracy, like in Korea, you always feel like there was that fight within the bureaucracy, and then people change power. So in the story with KISS was, okay, in the 80s, you have a military coup, a different administration who don't value KISS like the President Park. So you kind of, this kind of lost KISS lost power. And then KISS was merged with KAIS, right? And became KAIS. KAIS gained the upper hand. So KISS, then later on, of course, it became independent in the 90s. But then it became a basic research and received most fundings. And then, like you said, and then the outcome was over time, the JBO acquired its research capacities. And then also that's become a problem with Korean research institutes, because KISS also spin off a lot of several, like in Daejeon, like what I show in this map. This is the key research hub, and they were hoping to become like Taiwan Hsinchu, like industrial park, where you have ideas and spin-off entrepreneurs. But it just never worked that way, because the researchers talking about their research products sleeping in the cabinet, the people don't take it for commercialization, or, you know, JBO might have more research capacity, like commercialization capacity than the research. So that become always a feature, attention in the Korean context. How do you encourage entrepreneurship? So that was kind of my response. I guess I took a long route to answer that question. And in terms of the transnational network question, I think that was a good question. I think I haven't quite mapped out the kind of transnational networks. I think, for example, you correctly pointed out the diffusion of institutions, US, Battelle Memorial. I think that play a very important role in the early beginning. But also what I learned is those informal network was more those returnees through their experience working overseas before, and the ideas, they come back. I think that was what I was trying. So that's when I started to think, actually, maybe their work experience, or for example, that Kim Jae-kwon, he worked in Germany, and he was always obsessed with the steel development because he worked in DMAG, and maybe there was that. So he has a certain view about how things should be done, and that influenced his decision in the auto industry, which I didn't get to talk to. That was also, it's going to be my next project, was also explaining the case on the auto. But to make a long story short, from what I understood was, but I still haven't figured out how the connection was made. For example, in the auto industry, people often just think that Korea was following after the Japanese. You know, the people, an easier way you see in most earlier literature, following the Japanese. But I think if you look at how auto industry came about in Korea, it was also Hyundai took over. The program came to Hyundai, but according to what they argue was Hyundai responded to the call, because for him, his intervention was he needed domestic content. And also his idea was he think of citizen car. And I think that was his idea of living in Germany. He said, you can't have those foreign joint ventures in Korea. They want to change models every year. So that doesn't help the develop local indigenous capacity. But he said you need a scale economy. What do you do with scale economy? You need so he thought the idea of citizen car, meaning small cars. So you don't change models every year. So you want the local assemblers to build to reach that economy of scale, and they want the domestic content, like you need the local parts. So he was using that. I think he was very influential in that idea. And then I think, I don't have a direct evidence, but I think that was his influence in his experience seeing in Germany. He thought of Volkswagen. I think that was kind of the, but the point, and later on the story was automobile industry, how they did was, again, the connection was through British. They bought, I think it was a British design, Italian design, and British for the Italian designer, and then British focusing on the car. And then later on the Japanese went in for the engine. So again, it was not a pure what we think of modeling after Japan, but it was kind of this hybrid. And I think that has to do with, but that needs to be verified. So I'm just putting out a hypothesis I observed. So there was this kind of a lot of the informal transnational connections as opposed to a formal connections. And then I think maybe that combination was the developmental ideology that make this happen. Because if they were working under a structure, right, those agencies, but you will under a specific structure, you have the geopolitics, geopolitical competition, the pressure. So the pressure for you to develop your country to catch or to compete or to catch up with others. And I think that was that those who would navigate in a very specific context. Those agencies were able to do this in a very specific context. Yeah. Does that answer your question, or do I have one more?
Yes, that's perfect. So now let's, I'd like, let me see if there is something on the web chat. No. Okay. Then it's open to the questions. Antonio, the first one. Okay. Who else? You can raise the hand or just say, okay, Antonio, Cristiano, and Hockey, would you like to?
No, I just would like to say to Michelle.
And Washington.
Yes.
So, but would you like to raise a question also?
No, just a remark I would like to make.
Okay. To make so maybe if we could okay, so Antonio, Cristiano, Washington, and then you make the comment. I think that we can do it all together. Yeah.
Okay.
Two questions and one comment. Okay.
Okay, it's getting very late, so I don't want to tire Michelle too much. I'm sure you're going to have an opportunity. I just want to raise a couple of issues. First of all, I thought it was a fascinating talk, being a historical sucker as I am, in terms of understanding development and why industrial choices are made. You really have to go into the agencies, as Moisés said, and engineers and professionals are key, candidates for as a key factor for explaining that, because a lot of the political economy, discussion is very rarefied in relation, in terms of deducing, why these choices were made, from the economic explanations and not really looking into the actual history. I mean, what is fascinating, for people like me and several others here, who have worked on the historical base of Brazilian development, is like how many points of context, the resonance you have between the Korean and the Brazilian history. And I mean, of course, I think what we have to think about developing some comparative study there, because it's an issue of sequences of institutions, but I mean, some of the processes are the same. Brazil also had, Brazil inverted some of the events there. Brazil had a steel industry in the 30s. And tried to build an aeronautics industry in the 50s with a technological institute. Was sort of equivalent to KAIST, with a lot of engineers from abroad who also made very high salaries. Some of the mechanisms, the incentives are quite like, in bringing people from abroad. Then Brazil in the late 60s, had like a return program like Korea did with which is scientists and engineers who were studying abroad. Brazil did that in the late 60s, but it didn't pan out in industry, And that's what I think the big sort of enigma when you do this comparison. Why, if Brazil had some of the same process and mechanism, we didn't pan out these industries. Similar industries are able to develop them. Mm-hmm. Okay, you also had an authoritarian military government, somewhat enlightened as Park Chan-hoo and perhaps others like Rocky can develop that better than I can. But when you look at the process, there are quite similar process, in a different orders and under different contexts. And I think we have to pay more attention to about the institutional arrangements and the opinion. I agree with you, there are a lot of informal contexts, but like institutional arrangements, I think made a big difference, what happened, to this informal context. What was the substract of that, I'm not gonna, I mean, I had several questions, but I'm just gonna perhaps make one general question, and then I will just, leave a couple of comments. One basic question that's kind of comes out in Brazil is what's the role of, because in a way you mix, in your presentation, science and engineers. In science and engineers, they have very different outlook, which in a way, at the end, you mentioned, you had the KAIST, was work science oriented, they do like training, graduate programs, but they don't commercialize anything. And engineers, they tend, to have more an industrial inclination. You said that the engineers who came back, or the quasi-scientists or engineers who came back from the US and Britain, they had an industrial experience. And that's a big difference. Also, Brazil in the late 60s, brought back science and engineers who had worked at Bell Labs and other, in Mattel, including around the same time, the late 60s, early 70s. But then, by then, the scientists already kind of controlled the Brazilian sort of policy space. So there's not much space for engineers to do much. And in fact, I have some hypotheses. The engineers had an opportunity in the 50s, but then they lost the opportunity to the scientists in terms of who took over the policy space. And then sort of the geopolitical plays a role there, because Brazil went into a nuclear adventure. And so nuclear physicists took the upper hand. And so there's no space for engineers to cover that, or to be on the pinnacle of the policy space. So that's, I'd just like to hear comments of if there are any difference about the science and engineers in the Korean case. And then I had just to leave it in the background, not for now. I don't want to answer that, but just for us to talk later to remember if there are like a role for foreign science who came to Korea at all, besides the networks. I mean, they're like the imported science or not. What is the role? I mean, we talked a little bit about the military. Was there any competition for funds between the military and some of the industrialists, engineers? No, because that's something that happened a lot in Brazil. The military are competing for funds. No. And then, and also what happened to the Korean weapon industries? If something happened, I think you said the missile programs was dissolved, but anything was left out of that. But don't answer those last three. I'd just like to hear a general perception about the science and engineers. We can talk about the other three later. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That was very good questions. So do I respond right away, or do you collect? I
think it's better to collect all questions, so then you can pick and choose or whatever you feel like answering. So that it's kind of late for everyone, including for you. So who's the next speaker?
That's me, right? Okay. Oh, hi again, Michelle.
Yes.
I really appreciated. I thought your presentation was very interesting. I already downloaded your article on the comparison between Korea and Taiwan, so I'm going to read it as soon as possible. For now, I was thinking, of course, comparing your approach and your results with Peter Evans' book, which is for us here in Brazil probably the most famous bibliography on the topic. And I thought it was very interesting to see all the detail that you brought in, as Moises already mentioned. But considering this, I was curious about challenges to the arrangements, to these connections between state and the scientists and the firms. Was there some sort of challenge? Because that's Peter Evans' conclusion, that the shortcoming of the embedded autonomy arrangement is the lack of connection to society. It's pretty much a connection between elite. Since you're bringing all those details and all that information that you saw, did you get any data that shows some sort of that missing link that Peter Evans identifies?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's now Washington.
Hi. Hi, Professor Michel. I just would like to thank you to Professor Botelho, who invited me. I would like to say thank you for the invitation. It was quite good. Thank you. And I don't know if I was quite sure about the link that you made between India and South Korea and capitalism and technology. Just briefly, just in short, I make notes, but I don't know if I understood quite well. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, so
okay, Hsieh, final comments. Hsieh, I think Hsieh, you want to make some final comments?
Yes. First of all, hi, Michelle. I would like to thank you very much for your rich presentation. And my remark is that we have talked before in Seoul about the role that KIST played in all this developmental state in South Korea. But just now I realized how strong is this participation, and I surely will reevaluate this role that I was writing about in my dissertation. Thank you very much for the enlightenment of it.
Okay, thank you. So now my turn. Okay. Yeah, thank you for all the questions are quite good. And I want to thank Antonio. I think your point, and I think our discussion with Moises before, that kept reminding me the question, Brazil went through similar processes, but how come the outcome is different? So that kind of still haunts me whenever I talk about this, and I still haven't quite. So the only thing that maybe I could come up with was also, it's probably the configuration of the state was, the elites, and it was the scientists and those programs. And I think my impression was the Brazilian correctly if I'm wrong, I'm just from the general readings you have Brazilian bureaucracy, you have a bureaucracy more, it's not your interest is not towards the country, but towards it's the bureaucracy was allied with a foreign capitalist, as opposed to bring in indigenous development. Whereas I think that the key distinction people often talk about when they talk about bring the state back in was the Korean or the Taiwan, the state was more, allied with, you have more the local, you develop local industries. So they were able to negotiate with the foreign it was a very nationalistic in comparison to Brazilian and Latin American. That's my impression, but I think you're definitely right that, you went through similar and then from what you just described to me, that's fascinating. And also bring in the scientists and engineers. And I think you are absolutely right in asking that question about scientists and engineers. And actually, I got that question here last month when I did a presentation first time here at my workplace. And I think it's interesting in that I was thinking that too. I think among the people I look at them, I don't think they really make that distinct identification for themselves as engineer. They often associate themselves with researchers. And then whereas I think in the Taiwanese, in comparison, Taiwan, you actually have more engineers. And then here, they often emphasizing on the engineering approach. The bureaucracy was, when the MCI took power, the guy, Owen Cho himself, talking about engineering approach. So I think during the 70s, the policy, I think it was more the engineering policy. But as among the scientists and engineers, the people I interviewed with the kids, I think they were mostly trained in engineering sciences, like engineering. They are not like a pure science, but they're very practical. But they don't really make themselves and they were okay to serve with the government, work for the government and helping the government solving problems, very practical. As opposed to the other, maybe there was that debate also happened in Korea earlier. They said by establishing KIST, you're working on those industrialization programs, it's like you're giving away the Nobel Prizes to market. You serve the interests of the state rather than, but that seems not, but I think my approach here was how they help to, they basically like the infrastructure arm of the state to making that sound decisions in the 70s. But in the 80s, I think the shift was, it could be in the military. Yeah, I haven't worked out what happened in the 80s, but most of the dominant discourse was 80s, the economists took over. You start to have a very prevalent economist took over. But still, like in the policy, like you look at the high-tech policies, it was another group of, that's something I want to look into, was another group of military who had a background in electrical engineering who seems to get his attention. That's how my brief understanding was how the IT sector got picked up in Korea, because you look at the 70s, IT, which now Korea claimed distinction, was not under the radar during Park Chung-hee's peak. It was very heavy in the chemical industrialization, but IT, he was interested in telecommunication because of his experience I think it was war-related purposes. But IT really got picked up in the 80s, but partly the argument of telecommunication infrastructure was also by this military guy, but he had a PhD in electrical engineering. And also the group of people that we talk about possibly move from ADD to other research institute, but I don't know, I need to verify that. But I think the dominant discourse is that that's how Korea went to liberalization, because it was the economists gained the upper hand in that whole bureaucracy change, in the bureaucracy competition. So, but I think that needs to be, but I think that question was very good. I always think that, you have similar processes, how come the outcome are different? And yeah, and then I would love to read more about the Brazilian, that when you talk about the scientists, engineers, how the engineers lost their, I think that may make a very strong argument in connecting to what I'm arguing here. And also the question, the embedded and autonomous, that's a great question. And I think the data I have was, yes, I don't think I overthrown Evan's argument, but I think I provided that whole I kind of opened the box of embeddedness. Yeah, and it does show it's very narrow alliances during the Parks period, and that's the problem. That's exactly, and how I show, by not having the engineers or those people, researchers who didn't go into the private. So that actually reinforced that very narrow basis of embeddedness. And that's what, if you look, people often measure it as inducement of entrepreneurship. In that sense, I think Korea really, it was a very narrow base, right? Like when they have the ideas and they pick Hyundai, but they kind of pass on the ideas to Hyundai, but never really spin off or diffuse to other sectors of the economy. Yeah, and which is a contrast to the Taiwanese case, which when I look at embeddedness, that was more a broad base, a diffuse, despite it's not a large capital, it's mostly SMEs. And that was also through this research institute, but that was more the research institute itself, they become the seeds for entrepreneurship. Yeah, but that's different. But I think your question is absolutely, but my data just basically show how that embeddedness take place. Yeah, and then including the scientists and engineers in that picture. And as for the question on India and Korea, I just want to make a quick point was the India and Korea, I think mostly the literature talk about how India was locked into a place because the capitalist was not interested in export-led industrialization, which was definitely much more challenging than ISI, right? Because then the capitalists can take all the perks from ISI for the protected market. That's what happened with India. Whereas in Korea, the government was able to push, Korea government was not only developmental aware, but they were able to push the capitalists for export-led industrialization through their carrots and sticks. Yeah. So did I answer the questions or any more questions?
Well, I think that's at least as from what I heard from the questions, I think that's perfect.
Yeah, the size of the engineers. That's a very good question. I think the size of the engineers are quite big in Korea, but I think the difference is they all work for the Jables. They all contain, but whereas in Taiwan with engineers, they become entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then in Korea, they also have, but whereas the research institute now, they become more like a scientist. They do research, but they have trouble commercialize their products. So it's a very separate, like you look at it, that's what they've been pushing for, even though they are applied research institute, but they're being trouble for private commercialization. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that
that's
answers
interesting
your,
because this is a major difference between Taiwan and Chaibals, because there is between Taiwan and South Korea, because it's much more SMEs based, and in the case of South Korea, large companies with the Chaibals. Yeah, that's. I think Alice Amsden has depicted it, this story.
Yeah.
Okay, I suppose we are now finishing.
Yeah, it was quite.
It was really great. I think we had a wonderful interchange here, and I'm also coordinator of our research program at the moment, at least until 2022 for 2 years. And I'm also Cristiano is also the coordinator. So we are also, I think we have a growing interest in building bridges between Asia and Latin America for comparative studies between both experiences. I think to be very, So this is these talks on Asian comparative capitalism are great for us. I'd like to thank you very much for your valuable time and your wonderful presentation.
Moisés, I just want to make a couple of announcements before you break up. Again, thank Michelle, for the excellent presentation and the discussion, which I think is also incredibly enlightening for all of us. I just want to, for those who are not familiar, we have as I put on the chat here, the seminar series, last webinar with Professor Kwan is in the YouTube. We streamed, and then your presentation also going to be streaming on YouTube. So you send the link. And also I want to call attention that we're going to have the final event for this year of the seminar cycle, which is going to run into 2021. But the last seminar for this year will be on December 16th. At 6 o'clock to 7:30 p.m. in Brazil, in Rio. And the speaker will be John West, is the author of the book Asian Century on the Knife Edge, and he's an adjunct professor at Stanford University and executive director of the Asian Century Institute, and has a long career in policymaking, both in the Australian Treasury as well as in OECD. So he's a connoisseur of the Asian political economy, and he's going to be talking about the Asia's political economy post-COVID-19, still the Asian century now. In a way, seeing whether some of these conclusions he had in his book in 2018 are they still valid. So I just want to invite all of you to that next event, including you, Michelle, if the time
sure.
allows.
By the way, the book is free for download. John West's book is free for download.
Yeah, so if you want to take a look at it. Okay, that's it. Sorry to interrupt the ending, but so thanks again, Michelle, and all the participants on my part.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you all for attending. I know it's quite late, and I also thank you for your great comments and also for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with the Brazilian colleagues. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
And,
great. Thank you very much.
It was great. It was great meeting you all.
In the next,
can, develop,
and hopefully we see Michelle also in Amsterdam, and maybe perhaps in the next webinar.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to log in if time permits me. Yeah.
Okay.
All
right.
Yeah, it was great discussion. Yeah. Bye.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Good
Michelle. Good night to everybody.
Bye. Good night.
Bye, Michelle. Thank